Alrighty. Hey, everyone. Thank you for making some time, as always, to join us here for our webinar series on the Products That Count feed. My name is Dan Hamaker, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the head of chapter for New York City here under the Products That Count umbrella. Really excited today to be joined by our guest, Spyri Karasavva, who is the CEO and co-founder of Dealops. Today, we're going to be talking about pricing in product management and around products in general. I think this is an underappreciated topic for a lot of PMs out there in the world, and something that I think Spyri brings a tremendous amount of insight and a unique perspective on. Of course, being a co-founder as well, she's got a ton of perspective on building businesses and software that's going to be broadly applicable to our audience. So really excited about today's conversation. Without further ado, Spyri, let me hand the ball to you to introduce yourself in more detail.
For sure. Nice to see you, Dan, and nice to meet you, everyone. I'm Spyri. As Dan mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Dealops. We're building a deal pricing platform for B2B companies. The way to think about it is that we give sales reps custom pricing recommendations per deal to help them close deals faster without over discounting. And at the same time, we help product and finance leaders experiment with their pricing and their discounting guidance. So before I started Dealops, I was the first go-to-market hire at Stitch. And I also worked in finance and pricing at Stripe. While I was at Stripe, I did a few different things in pricing, anything from pricing new products, new markets, all the way to working on pretty big strategic projects like repricing millions of existing users that were on legacy plans, and also doing a lot of day-to-day deal pricing with the sales team. We must have repriced hundreds of deals together. So super excited for today.
Awesome. That's great. Cool. Well, let's dive in here without further ado. So we're going to be running this as a fireside chat. So not going to be going through formal content here in today's presentation, but want to take this opportunity just to have a discussion and obviously make that discussion interactive. So if at any point as an audience member you have questions, please feel free to drop those into the chat, and we'll try to incorporate them into the discussion as we go along. So to start, I'm interested just in learning a little bit more about your journey here, Spyri. I know pricing might not jump off the page as everybody's, plan A from a career standpoint. So how'd you find yourself in this niche and starting a business to address it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I definitely didn't dream of becoming a pricing leader when I was like a little girl, but I fell into it. And this is actually very common for folks in pricing. So for me, how it happened was that I started my career as an investor. And then at some point, I wanted to jump to the operating side. So I actually decided to join Stripe to be part of the finance team. And that was 2020, when Stripe was already quite established as the company, post product market fit, starting to think about an IPO. And for the finance team, what was top of mind back then was monetization, particularly monetizing the existing user base better, but also bringing in high quality revenue. So what pretty much ended up happening was that my entire time at Stripe, I worked on pricing projects. And because of that, I ended up experiencing a lot of problems related to pricing. So when the time came to start my own company, I was reflecting on problems I had experienced myself in my career, and pricing optimization was definitely one of the first that I came up with.
That's interesting. I think it makes a ton of sense. Obviously, it's such a foundational part of operating a business. It's also a foundational part of delivering a product. And that was something that in conversations leading up to this one, you and I talked about a little bit, where there are a lot of reasons why product managers should care about pricing, even if it's not necessarily the first thing top of mind. There's obviously a lot of legwork that has to go into delivering a product before you're even in a position to think about what it might get priced at. But can you just talk a little bit more about why you think PMs should have pricing top of mind?
Yeah, I think the best way to probably kind of take that question is to split in two parts, because I think depending on company segment, I think the reason why PMs might care about pricing is very different. So maybe we can segment the companies into early stage, pre-product market fit startups, and then second segment would be much later stage companies. Think of maybe companies like Stripe. So when we start with early stage, I think everybody's aware of that there's one goal for the entire company, and that is get to product market fit. And there are three different components to getting there. There's obviously you need to build a product that people want and a product that solves a real problem. And then you need to nail your messaging and your positioning. And then you also need to find the right go-to-market strategy. And this includes things like choosing your go-to-market model, your distribution channels, but also choosing the right pricing model and the right pricing point. And for me, I think there are like a few things to consider there. So first is that you need to have pricing that supports your unit economics, because growth at all costs at this point is over. I think we want to build high quality companies from the beginning. You need to start thinking of pricing as a signal of the value that you're creating to your different customer segments. And at this point, keep your eyes open, because I think your perception of the value that you create can be quite different from the value that you actually do. And the last component here is that you need to have a pricing model that aligns with how your target customers think about pricing, or like think about buying software, like speak their language, similar to what you would do about positioning. And this is a very dangerous one, because a lot of folks kind of starting companies, they want to revolutionize an industry, and that includes the pricing model. But if you're trying to disrupt a legacy industry where everyone, for example, is very used to buying software based on number of seats, and you're here suggesting, selling your software based on number of API calls or number of tokens or something like that, you need to have a very, very good reason why, because maybe this is going to be the strategy that unlocks like your go-to-market machine, and you're able to grow really, really quickly. Or maybe this is going to be the thing that confuses your ICP, and you're not able to actually like kind of be part of like IFP processes against competitors and things like that. So definitely lots to think about in pricing in the early stages. And I know that the way I'm describing things right now, it might not sound like something like that a PM should be thinking about, but I 100% disagree with that. Early stages, one team, everyone is thinking about product market fit. And as a product owner and a product leader at that stage, monetization is definitely something that should be one of your top 4 priorities.
That's really interesting. I want to circle back to the two of the points that you raised that, in my experience, sometimes can be in conflict with each other. So one is obviously the new attention on unit economics. As you mentioned, the days of growth at all costs are behind us. We're in a brave new world where, as a tech company, we need to be profitable. Crazy, I know. On the flip side, as you mentioned, there are often opportunities to disrupt legacy industries, but part of being a legacy industry is now having budgets allocated around the spend required to support your product at the clients that we as a disruptor are trying to go win. So as new businesses emerge with new technologies that might bring about kind of different cost structures, how do you think about the best ways to fit those cost structures into the budgets that your target market might have constructed over the course of buying legacy tools for years?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's like a very tough question for B2B SaaS or B2B startups in general, because you obviously, as you start kind of selling to different companies, you want to go after an existing budget. And there is a lot that goes with that. There's a lot of crowdedness, usually with like vendors, because at this point, there are a lot of tools targeting like B2B companies, right? So you need to be aware of how crowded the market is and how crowded the messaging is, and how you're positioning yourself and how you're differentiating yourself when it comes to how you're describing your offering. And hopefully your offering does have like unique features and does add unique value. And then the second point there is the market is also crowded when it comes to pricing messaging. So again, there you need to kind of be able to separate yourself from the noise. And I would probably, I think it's like a case by case basis, but generally the way I would think about it is start with where you're adding value and how much value you're adding. And if you're able to articulate the ways you're adding value and the amount of value that you add, then you allow your customers to also guide you on what's the right way to price for that value. And I have a very specific example from our company, Dealops. Our value prop is pretty much that we're optimizing your current pricing, and we're able to help you unlock an extra, let's say, 20% of revenue that's currently lost to over discounting. So hearing that, for me as a pricing person, it made a ton of sense to go out to the market and try to price our product as a percentage of the uplift, the revenue uplift that we create for other companies. And I was saying, okay, we generated an extra, let's say, $1 million of revenue for you. So we're going to go and capture 10% of that. But pretty much what ended up happening was that the market came back and said, yeah, we love how aligned you are with us, right? And kind of you want to only capture a percentage of the value that you create, but we don't want to spend every single month fighting with you on how you define the revenue uplift. So pretty much we ended up changing our pricing model to be aligned with what was the simplest and the most intuitive thing for our customers. So yeah.
That's an awesome anecdote. I love it in large part because focusing on value is also where product managers need to start when they are coming up with new solutions to the problems that they're hearing from their clients, right? That kind of notion of let's start with the value. It's sort of a different framing of let's start with the problem, which is the ethos that we should be taking as PMs anytime we're tackling new solutions. And I think the value also helps bridge some gaps that I'm seeing even more actively now that we're entering this kind of new world of AI and an impetus to incorporate AI into more of the solutions that we deliver to solve problems. Even other emerging technologies like blockchain can come with new variable costs that are harder to model, right? When you don't exactly know the usage of your product or how to anticipate that, and also harder to present to clients who might be used to and might prefer being able to set a budget against a cost that they can anticipate with incremental increases that are easier to model, right? So do you have any thoughts or tips on how to square that circle where you've got a variable cost basis and your client is looking for predictability in terms of their price?
Yeah, so the most common way, honestly, to go about pricing products like that is with something called a monthly minimum or a contractual minimum. So the way this works is imagine that you're a company that you have a variable cost base. Maybe it's tokens, or maybe it's maybe you're building on top of Twilio, you pay per API call or per SMS or something like that. And your customers want to kind of enjoy some of the benefits of a pay-as-you-go model and a usage-based pricing, but they also at the same time, they have a CFO or a procurement team that asks for that predictability. The way to go about it in these situations is that the way you structure that customer contract is that they commit to a certain it's usually you're pricing based on volume, right? So if they commit to a certain minimum of volume every month, they're able to enjoy a larger discount. So maybe you're expecting that maybe you're selling to this customer, you're expecting that they will have a monthly usage of 1 million, let's say API calls every month. And you're expecting that to ramp maybe from 1 million to 3 million by the end of the year. So what you're saying when you're signing the contract or the term that you put in is that for every single month, you're going to pay for a minimum of let's say maybe 600 or 700K. And then if you're going to pay only for the upside on top of that. And in that, by doing that, you're going to give them a 40% discount. Otherwise, they wouldn't get a discount that high. So that's probably the most common way to go about that.
Cool. I think that's really helpful tactically. especially coming from an expert like yourself. So that's maybe a good transition here, I think. And maybe, some people would say this would have been helpful to start with, but I'd love to just get into, at a high level, kind of what goes into coming up with a price, right? That can be, I think, a tricky 0 to 1 challenge for people who haven't done it before. So do you mind just walking us through some of the steps that you take or would recommend as somebody's embarking on that goal?
Yeah, I would say there are 4 different steps. So the first thing is definitely coming up with the right pricing model. That's probably the hardest part of pricing, and where pricing is more of an art than a science. The second step would be coming up with the right list price. And then the third step is coming up with the right discounts. And then fourth step, iterating on enforcing these discounts and then iterating over time. But maybe we can take things one by one. So coming up with the right pricing model. So again, this is very different depending on if you're a startup or a larger company. If you're at a startup, or even if you're a larger company, but you're launching a very unique product that's very different from the rest of the portfolio. So my advice is follow the path of the least resistance. You're not going to get like pricing right probably the first time, but what you can do is listen to your customers, prospects, and users, share a couple of different options with them and see what they gravitate towards. And that's kind of goes back to the first example I shared on kind of what we did with our own pricing. If you are in a more like late stage company and the pricing model is already set, like you honestly have very little room to move there for like that new feature, that new product. And you have a lot more room to experiment with list price, which is the second step of pricing. So here there are a few different quantitative methods that you can use to, and I'm happy to share some material later on. There's some quantitative methods that you can use to come up with the right list price per product. But to be honest, everything like at the end of the day boils down to talking to customers or doing a lot of research with potential customers and competitors, and kind of keep on thinking again, like going back to first principles and thinking about how much value is your product adding, and how is it differentiated from competitors? Second, how much of the value that you're adding do you actually want to capture? So rule of thumb is that like a healthy company captures between 10 to 20% of the value it creates. And there you have like wiggle room, depending on how competitive your industry is and how good you are at branding and positioning yourself and how differentiated your product is. And then some of the other metrics to think there are, your CAC to LTV ratios, your payback period. Maybe you want to price, maybe you're selling to enterprise customers and you want to price your product in a way that you know that in a 3-year contract, they have a payback in 1 or 2 quarters. So these are the right things to think in mind, and keep on going back to what's the company's goals and business models. And then the last thing to think about here is that kind of think about how your sales team operates. If you're the type of company that you know that your sales reps discount a lot, then you know that you want to adjust your list prices to be high to accommodate for these discounts. Or if it's the opposite, if you're like a self-serve type of company and you know that you're not giving anyone more than 5% or 10% of a discount, you need to have maybe a lower list price to allow you to continue to be competitive in the market. And then finally, if you have other products in your portfolio and you have precedents, of course, use them, look at customer usage, speak to existing customers, and make sure to also speak to other teams. Finance, sales, marketing, pricing is supposed to be extremely cross-functional, and everyone in the organization has opinions on like what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, no, I love some of that. A number of questions come to mind, but I think that point that you mentioned about the nature of your sales team really resonates, right? Obviously, we're going to have folks here on this call who work with pretty robust B2B sales teams, others who have no sales team and are in a fully PLG driven go-to-market business, or perhaps a B2C company. So can you just speak to how some of those pricing strategies maybe translate to those different go-to-market motions?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe we can talk about like a more like traditional sales-led motion versus like a PLG motion. On the sales-led side, the way to think about this is that you have a pricing leader that comes up with the pricing model and the list price that goes on the website. And then after that, they're also responsible to maybe potentially work with the finance team or do this themselves, but they're responsible to come up with a discounting guidance for the sales team. So think of this as a set of rules that sales reps should follow and discount the product according to volume. So maybe that when volume goes up by, let's say, 20%, you give an extra 5% discounts. And the whole idea there is that you are the one who's responsible for protecting the company margins, and you allow the sales reps to be responsible for just driving growth. So kind of what happens on the day-to-day is that you're responsible to serve that kind of guidance to reps, and that usually there are no systems that are good for doing that. So this happens in spreadsheets, long Notion docs, Confluence docs, there is a disconnect very often between the guidance that the pricing leader or the finance leader puts in place and what actually ends up happening in the field. And it's very, very hard for someone on the product side to know what's causing the disconnect. Is it actually that the customers have low willingness to pay? Maybe the product is not adding as much value as you originally hoped for. Or B, is it potentially that the sales team is just not performing well? They're not doing a great job like pricing your product. And that's kind of an area that's very, very important to dive deeper and figure out how are reps discounting the product and how many proposals it takes for a deal to close, and how, what's the discount rate in the first proposal versus the last proposal, and kind of what's the difference between how the top reps are pricing and everyone else. Because usually there's a 1% of reps that does an excellent job with pricing, and then there is like the average rep. So your job is to figure out what's going on and what can I do to bridge that gap. And that's actually where we're focusing as a company today.
That's super compelling. It brings up a topic that came up in some of the discussions that you and I had ahead of today's call, where I think you talked about pricing often being seen as a bit of a hot potato inside of an organization, right? It's something that everybody knows is necessary and it's always there, but nobody wants to hold on to it and be the full-time owner necessarily, just given some of the pitfalls that come, right? I mean, obviously, priced incorrectly, a product can have trouble launching, you can have pretty substantial impacts on your team members that derive a lot of their income from commission that they earn by selling or renewing, right? So there's a lot at stake in coming up with price, and it is an important responsibility. So just curious, especially for folks in product where, as you said, we have a responsibility to guard margin and also to represent the value of what we're delivering appropriately. But then you've got salespeople and account managers and others with a need to drive new business and grow the top line for the company. How do you see the interplay there often, and do you have any recommendations for product people in navigating some of those discussions?
Yeah, I think at its core, the biggest thing that causes a lot of conflict is like the uncertainty of what I think every single person at a B2B company, even if the company is doing incredibly well, I think if you ask every executive from every team, they're all going to tell you that they think that the product is underpriced. I think it's the one thing that everyone can agree on.
That resonates, yeah.
Exactly, and they can't agree on why. I think depending on who they ask, there's like the blame game happening. Folks will try to blame the sales team or the marketing team or the product team. So that's so I would say a lot of the tension comes from that uncertainty of what's going on with pricing. And I think there are a couple of different ways to actually bring data into the equation and help relieve some of that uncertainty. The number one thing today is that you might find it surprising, but very basic pricing data is actually not widely available at companies. So things like, what's your average price and discount across products, across sales team, across different reps, across different types of customer segments, or for example, across deals with different competitors. these things to me sound extremely simple, and it's data that every organization has at its disposal, or maybe they're in the heads of the sales reps, but like this data exists and it's just not tracked properly. So one first step that you could take to help with some of this like pricing conflicts is bring some of that, get access to some of that data and bring that to the forefront when you're making decisions. And maybe every QBR that you do, like you spend some time actually evaluating also pricing performance. And you do this, by cohort, by segment, by geography. I would think that would probably create a lot of very interesting conversations and help you shift away from kind of the blaming conversations into like problem solving.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, anytime there's uncertainty in any software related process, at least on a product side, my advice to PMs that I work with is always, let's try to get ahead of that. Let's try to squash that as soon as possible. But for a pricing conversation, right, obviously you kind of need to know what you're working with a little bit before you slap a sticker on it and say, okay, it's going to cost this much. So curious, where do you find the right point in the software development lifecycle to be for initiating conversations about pricing it?
Yeah. Internal conversations or external conversations?
That's a great clarification. I would say both.
Yeah. So I would say that again, that depends on how big your portfolio is and kind of what's your existing user base. But I would say as early as possible, the better, in terms of both internal and external conversations. From the internal point of view, pricing is often a blocker for launches. And a lot of different folks, especially like the C-suite, have very strong opinions on pricing that are not necessarily backed by data. But they're backed by instincts or maybe what they're seeing in the market. So you should get in front of those folks as early as possible to make sure that you have clear alignment on the pricing model, which is the part that causes, I would say, the most friction internally. And secondly, you're aligned on the website, the list price. And then in terms of external conversations, I would say, pricing is equal to like willingness to pay, which is again ties back to the value that you're creating. So as you're going in early days and you're doing user research calls, or you're speaking to existing customers and you're trying to understand about the problem that you're solving and the impact that you're creating for them, that's the right point to also start kind of exploring how can you quantify the impact that you're creating, or what's the ROI of that impact? And then you can start like putting numbers in front of them.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, and that I think is super helpful for that initial phase, right? Where we've got to establish something that we take to market to start, and off of which we begin learning. Then obviously you get to the point where you're starting to learn, and that's coming through the course of having conversations with existing and potential clients. Now you're in a position where you're actually beginning to negotiate and you're considering discounts. There's the obvious one, right? You can't at least for too long sell features for less than it costs you to deliver them, right? That's not a strong long-term strategy. But are there other thresholds or general guidelines that you might put out there to indicate, hey, this discount might be too deep and it's the right time to say no?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, on the first point, I would say there are probably a few cases that you would price a product at a loss. And I can give you a few examples and why this potentially could be sustainable for a little bit in the long term.
Okay.
I would say maybe the first one is, think of your product. Is this like a front door product that maybe opens up opportunities for expansion? Because maybe think of companies like Square, right? They're obviously selling hardware, but they're making all of their money from like the payment processing fees. So usually the hardware is sold at a loss. So that's probably like a sustainable strategy. The second thing to think about is maybe is that product that you are launching right now, is this more of a defense play? Is it going to make your existing customer base stickier? So in that case, you know what, maybe it is worth it, especially if your industry is becoming more competitive and more crowded. And then finally, is it maybe like a table stakes feature? Maybe you're like a little bit behind that your competitors, everyone else has already launched with that. You're trying to catch up and you don't have the right to monetize this particular feature.
Mm-hmm.
I would say maybe these are the only exceptions I can think of at the spot that you probably would price at a loss, and it would be a decision that you would stand behind. But other than that, I think your question was what are the right discount thresholds?
Yeah, well, first off, let me say I'm glad I made that mistake. That was a great correction, so thanks for that detail. But no, I was asking, yeah, when's a discount too deep, and how do you know?
Yeah, so there are rules of thumb that to have in mind, and then we can also talk about this in a bit more detail. But my favorite quote from one of the pricing leaders I've worked with was, unless your enterprise customers are asking for 60% discounts, you probably are pricing too low.
Okay, good to know. So there's some wiggle, to say the least.
Yeah, exactly. And then again, that depends on kind of the type of organization you are, and if your motion is sales first or maybe like, product first. But yeah, when you think of your discounting guidance, the way to think about it is think of like your customer segmentation and where are you getting most of your, I guess, volume of customers, but also money today. Is this more of the long tail? So you're targeting all of these tiny startups or potential in SMB companies, or is it like you have like the whale effect that maybe 70-80% of your revenue is coming from that, like the top 10% like enterprise customers. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. And then you should start kind of modeling out the different like scenarios with a different discounting guidance. And maybe you have 3 different tiers. And maybe tier 1 is SMBs, tier 2 is mid-market, and tier 3 is enterprise. And then start playing out with maybe, SMBs is like 10% discount. The second tier is 30%, and the last tier is 50%. Model that out for your existing customer base and see where you land. And then start maybe you can create like 2-3 different scenarios and see what was the impact on both revenue and profitability. And that's a great conversation to have with your CEO. Then, yeah.
Yeah, I like that. That's compelling. Yeah, kind of extrapolate, right? Play it out. Okay, if we were to apply this discount more often in the future, where would that lead us? Cool. It looks like we've got a couple questions rolling in from the chat, which is awesome. So let's go through those. So first question, how do you conduct customer research for pricing strategy?
Yeah, so I would say to be fully full transparency, that's the part of the pricing work that I have like the least experience in, because I was so pricing usually it can sit in finance, product, or marketing, and I sat in finance. So my approach to pricing was definitely like P&L first, and it was at companies that were more established. So so the goal was at the time just like monetize better. But now as a founder, I have to do a lot of the early pricing work myself. And at this point, we're also we've had conversations with hundreds of pricing leaders at companies from different stages. So that's where my answer will come from. So in terms of how you do customer research, I would say it's the same conversations that you would be having about like when you're doing product development. That's when you also sprinkle in pricing. I don't think that you need to have a separate conversation just for pricing, especially if you're in early stages. Again, you just tie it back to the value that you're creating and try to understand the willingness to pay there. And then once you're ready to launch and you have like maybe 3 different pricing options, that's when you put them in front of people and you get, you see naturally where they gravitate towards. And it's very, very clear usually. And you could try to do the thing that B2B SaaS, like the very common thing that companies and salespeople do is that, you try to give them 2 options and one of them is obviously way worse than the other. Everyone knows that. Try not to do that, and try to actually have like options that are maybe in similar value, but they have different pros and cons, and ask questions and try to understand why a customer would pick one versus the other.
That's great. Cool. Appreciate the candor there. And then second question, how often can you change pricing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's play it again in two parts. And I know that I do that a lot, but I hate to give answers that are, it depends. I think it's very consulting like. But with pricing, it's one of these like topics that it's highly visible and it can create a lot of negative publicity for you as a company. As I mentioned before, I worked on big repricing projects at Stripe. Actually, I worked on the first two ever kind of repricing projects that Stripe ever did, where we went back in time and repriced millions of users on legacy plans. So that was a very well thought out, like 7-8 month type of initiative. And it was the first one that Stripe did in, I think, I think at that point it was maybe 9 years since the company started. So when it comes to website pricing, the bigger you are as a company and the larger your installed base is, the more thought out an initiative like that needs to be, and the less frequently you're able to play with these numbers. But good news, if you're a startup, you're obviously able to do that a lot faster. And even if you are, and then the second thing that you can tweak with pricing is actually deal pricing and the discounting that you provide on a deal by deal level. And the good news there is that this is actually equally accessible to both startups and large companies. And in that part, you can iterate continuously. And pretty much the way you do that is that you maintain the same list prices on your website, but you give different guidance to the sales team. And you could do that on a quarterly basis. Maybe you give them an extra 5% discount for this particular product. And by the way, companies do that all the time, especially in the current environment that everybody's launching some sort of AI offering. And they want to show that there's high adoption of these AI offerings. They just discount them very, very heavily for a couple of quarters. So you're able to do that, especially if you have the right systems in place, that you're able to experiment with kind of SKU level pricing and discounting on a deal by deal basis.
Love that. You're speaking our language here on the product side when you're talking about iteration. So that's great. I know that was actually one of the principles that you brought up that we didn't get to just yet. So I'd like to dig into that a little bit more, because I think, again, that's an important part of product management in general. And I think it's important to think about how we can iterate on a price as we develop a set of features, those grow, but also as new dynamics emerge and evolve in the market, in our business and elsewhere, right? So maybe this, I think, expands on the answer you just gave a little bit, but can you just speak to maybe some best practices when it comes to, when to evaluate whether the pricing model you've been using is the right one, how to maybe go about some of that analysis, and where you might look for opportunities to change depending on what you see?
So I would say step one is always look at the data. Look at things like your contract sizes, your growth over time, your average discounts by product, and see how these are trending and if they're trending towards the wrong or the right direction. The second thing is that you need to speak to sales reps. You need to speak to the field. And I know that the product managers do that quite a lot when it comes to feedback that you want on the product. And I know that the sales team is usually they're very busy being in front of customers, so they're not always the most open to having a lot of these internal conversations. But this one is actually extremely, extremely important. You need to get their feedback in terms of what's resonating with the market and why they're winning and why they're losing deals. Unfortunately, you can rely on what the data that they add on Salesforce, because very often these are the exact fields that reps never fill out. Like the reason why a deal was lost, maybe they would just say pricing or competitor, but that's not enough for you to figure out what's going on. So speak to reps, try to have a few interviews, and try to interview both the top performing reps and then also like average reps. Data on like rep performance are not like given, they're not widely available in the organization, but like everyone knows. I think everyone knows who are like the reps that you need to speak to. And then The last thing that you probably need to do, first one was look at data. Second thing was speak to the sales team. And third thing is listen to gong calls. At this point, everyone is recording sales conversations. If you can get in front of your customers or the prospects directly, then the next best thing you can do is actually listen to the conversations that reps are having and see how they're describing the product and kind of where they're struggling. Because that's where you're going to kind of get a couple of different things. One, if the current pricing is resonating, or if it's considered too high or too low because the market dynamics have changed and now maybe the market is very competitive or buyer expectations are way higher. And two, you're going to see how if the reps have had to change the way they describe or pitch the product, or even the way they describe pricing. And that's for example, maybe in the past, they used to talk about pricing as a percentage of, I don't know, maybe they're saving you X dollars in engineering costs or something like that. But the reps have figured out that this kind of messaging hasn't been very successful. So now the way that they talk about it is very, very different. So that's kind of something that you can catch from listening to these conversations and get ahead of.
Interesting. Would you have a rule of thumb as to when to run that analysis? Is that, within 1 or 2 quarters after launch, or is that on a as needed basis, kind of as maybe you're getting some signal or other whiffs of information indicating you might want to revisit the pricing?
Yeah, I would say definitely that your first quarter post-launch, I would say it's probably unlikely that you've gotten pricing 100% perfect at launch. So definitely the first quarter post-launch is the time to work very closely with the sales team and iterate on pricing. And it's probably the time that the sales team will be best aligned like with you, and like they want to see you succeed and they want to make changes in pricing. So they want to give you a lot of feedback. So definitely take advantage of that window in time. And then after the first quarter launch, then I would say you just look at pricing metrics on like a monthly basis, similar to you probably do monthly business reviews, things like that, and only do like deep dives if you see things spiking or like going downwards in like weird ways. And then probably a deeper dive would be good to do once a quarter.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I like that. Something, I think about is the ebbs and flows of a business cycle. And this is particularly top of mind for me. I work at a company called Intap, and we are on a mid-year fiscal year. So this is actually week 1 of our new fiscal year. We're a July to June business. So exciting times, just flip the page on the calendar for us. But I can only imagine if I'd gone in with some proposals to revise our pricing model in Q4 of our last fiscal, that would have not been received super well. So just curious how you would recommend managing some of those stakeholder considerations on the go-to-market side as, we're trying to tinker and optimize the value of the product.
For sure. You should definitely not touch pricing at the times of year that is busier for the sales team. Q4 is the busiest time of the year. I think for most companies, something like 70% of their revenue comes in Q4. So definitely do not make any changes in pricing in Q4. And then besides Q4, end of month and end of quarter are the other really, really busy times for sales reps. And we're seeing that even with our current customers, because we're able to track like contract creation and proposal creation. We see most of the proposals coming in the last few days of the month. And the reason this is happening is that the way reps sell is that they're both, they're on like quarterly quotas. So the closer they get to the end of the quarter, or maybe the end of the month, depending on how their structure is based, the more like incentivized they are, and they want to close these deals as fast as they can. So maybe they're willing to give the customer also some extra discounts to just get them to sign before the quarter or the month ends. And the same thing with like Q4. That ends up being a really, really busy time in the year, because that's kind of when a lot of companies do planning. There are budgets that are being released, and reps know of that, and they want to kind of close deals within that window. So yeah, definitely stay away from these very busy times. And generally, good time to kind of launch pricing initiatives are probably like around mid-year, and give them a heads up of what's coming down the pipeline and why. and why is it actually going to help them close more deals and close deals faster? Because at the end of the day, that's if you're able to convince reps that you're going to help them make more money by either closing larger deals without affecting win rates, or closing more deals in the same amount of time, that's a no-brainer for them.
Yeah, love that. We've got about 15 minutes left, so would love to open the floor up to any of the questions here from the audience. Please feel free to drop those in the chat as they come to mind. Something I wanted to jump back to. So earlier in the conversation, you referenced pricing professionals, and I think that's super interesting. You know, you sort of alluded to your career path, obviously, and coming up on the finance side of the business, there's some level of pricing responsibility inherent to that department. But I think in your experience, you're beginning to see more and more professionals dedicated to pricing specifically at companies. Can you just speak to that trend a little bit and where you see it going?
Yeah, for sure. I think at this point, we're actually feels like pricing is really evolving at the function within tech companies. We're getting to the point that I think like executives are realizing that pricing is such an important like lever for growth, and are starting to build internal pricing teams like as early as like a late Series B, early Series C. And what kind of comes with that is that you have like this internal teams of like pricing experts who are responsible for the, you know, for everything from setting the pricing all the way to enforcing and iterating on pricing. And this is a job that in the past was honestly outsourced to consulting firms like Bain, McKinsey, BCG. So it's very, very interesting to see that coming in-house and being something that like folks like actually own. And with kind of the more like of the evolution of these teams, you start to see the evolution also of the pricing leader role. I think up until a few years ago, you were seeing a lot of maybe pricing analysts or like, you know, pricing managers and folks getting maybe up to the director title. But now we're starting to see a lot of VPs of pricing jobs like in the market, which just shows a lot like how like this function is becoming a lot more important. And those folks now also have budget and they're able to build pretty big teams, and they're able to also like have like budget for a lot of like external software. Because what companies are discovering is that pricing is one of these functions that you need to spend money to make money. So you're getting to that level now that you are a VP with like, you know, $1 million plus a budget at your disposal to spend on pricing experiments.
Yeah, super interesting. I think it makes a ton of sense. Like you said, it's such a lever for growth and also has so much impact on adoption and other things. So I totally understand the importance that companies are putting on it. So we have talked a decent amount about how pricing can change, how it can evolve, how you need to be communicating to stakeholders. I think obviously sales is probably our biggest stakeholder anytime we're talking about pricing. What are some tips that you would recommend for communicating pricing to sales? What is it that they're going to ask? What are some details they'll want to know? How can we get ahead of that message to present a package that is clear and compelling to them?
Yeah, so the reason I'm laughing, there are just pretty much two things that the sales team cares about, or two things that drive their behavior. Number one is incentives. Like you need to make sure that their incentive structure is aligned with the company goals and aligned with your product goals and like your pricing goals. So for example, if reps are getting comped based on number of, you know, the biggest like part of the compensation is number of customers they're winning, and you're trying to kind of increase pricing by 50% and incentivize like a certain type of customers, this is just not going to work right out of the box. Number one is you need to know their incentive structure, and you need to make sure that you either change the incentive structure to be aligned with your pricing or the other way around. And then the second thing that reps are motivated about or like are driven by is speed to close. Nobody likes spending like forever kind of trying to figure out what's the right pricing and the right discount for each of these SKUs. And each company, as the scale, they end up having 10,000 of SKUs. So if you're a sales rep and you're dealing with someone like me, right? And I just gave you this giant spreadsheet with all of my new prices for each of these SKUs. And I'm telling you, oh yeah, my prices are 5% different than the last quarter. So I'm asking you to do a ton of extra work to close a deal, and a ton of extra work that you consider probably admin and unnecessary. So make it easy for them. So you don't affect the speed that it takes for them to close a deal. So any kind of pricing enablement that you're doing needs to be extremely straightforward, extremely intuitive. Assume that half of the sales team is not going to join. So send out a very simple Slack message or an email outlining exactly the changes that you're making, exactly how this ties to their incentives and where they're going to end the year, and kind of how it's as simple as possible. And then you need to have the right systems. And if you have the right systems that are able to help them, like with some of that, take some of these decisions away from them, so they don't have to maybe scroll through a giant list of products, right? Maybe the system, like they can just type like the first 3 letters or something like that, or the system shows them the right like discounts per product. That goes a long way.
Yeah, I think that's pretty clever. And I assume that's something that you could hack a little bit, right? If you're not paying for something out of the box like Dealops or another tool to help you manage your pricing suite, I'd imagine you could put together a spreadsheet or a deck or some other piece of collateral that just provides that bit of support.
Yeah, so usually how it works is that companies put together a spreadsheet and then some accompanying like Google Slide or like Notion doc that kind of walks reps through how to use that pricing calculator spreadsheet. But unfortunately, that model breaks like quite quickly. That's what we did at Stripe. That's what most of our customers are doing today. And you get to the point that there's a lot of room for error, because reps are not spreadsheets people, right? So you can create a spreadsheet that you consider bulletproof on the product or the finance side, and you're like, there's no way anyone would ever misunderstand the spreadsheet or use it in an incorrect way. I promise you, they're going to find a way to do that. So you end up, I think, losing around like at least like 10-20% of like your pricing because of like a lot of arithmetic errors that happen in the spreadsheets. But it's still better than having nothing, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. I think that's good guidance. And especially like you said, in my experience, it's pretty consistent that you're not gonna be able to count on everybody at every meeting, obviously. So having that solid takeaway, that's a point of reference and helps avoid a flood of questions to you later that people could have had answered in your presentation. And that's always a good way to go, no matter what it is you're presenting. I'm going to circle back to one of the bigger topics of the day in technology, AI. I think it's presenting unique challenges across the board: software delivery, testing, pricing. I think is another unique challenge. Obviously, we're all dealing with the variable costs from these large language models, which are high, and also which in many cases introduce new cost bases for AI-enabled features that are different from those of our features that don't use AI quite as explicitly, or maybe don't even use LLMs, right? Because you can integrate a number of different models or develop your own with different cost bases than LLMs. So any tips for how to price products that introduce cost bases that are different from other products in your portfolio?
Yeah. So I would say honestly, I think that the strategy of kind of how to price them is probably the easiest part of the process of introducing these products. Because usually you could do some, depending again, if you're like a price taker or a price maker in the market, you're able to kind of decide if you want to do like a cost plus approach. And also that depends on kind of your type of customer. Because if you're selling to more enterprises, it's definitely going to be a la carte pricing, definitely something like cost plus. Versus if you're selling to startups, maybe you're able to have like a more bundled offering, or you're able to add a couple of additional SKUs there that allow you to price a bit higher. So there's a lot of work that goes into strategy. But the reason I'm saying that this is the simplest part of the pricing for these new SKUs is that I would say the other two components are way harder. Number one is rep enablement, training your sales team to sell these new products that are priced in a very different way than what they're used to. That is a full-time job on its own, and it requires a lot of work from like the product team, a lot of patience, a lot of monitoring and recurring kind of paying a lot of attention to this and doing a lot of iteration. And the second piece is the systems. right now, most companies are in pretty either homegrown or pretty legacy billing and CRM and quoting systems. So the idea of that you're adding new SKUs that have entirely different cost bases and they need to be built in a different way. That causes like, honestly, it causes like months and months of work for your internal ops and systems teams. And it's usually where things break and you end up with contracts that you've accidentally misquoted the customer. You miscalculated your own costs, and now you're charging the customer like 60K less. So you end up going under on this contract that you didn't expect you would. So I would say if I were to focus on like one thing is make sure that you get your systems right. And if you have an internal billing ops team, they should be your best friend when you're launching a new product like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another reason to start early and often, like you said, in the software development life cycle. Just get ahead of that and give your teams a little bit of leeway and time to get up to speed on what it is they're going to need to change internally to support this new feature. Any tips? I know we talked about flavors of this, but I just think it's really important. Any tips for communicating changes in pricing like this to clients? Again, they might be accustomed to one way of paying for your software, and all of a sudden now you're introducing a new way, or you're trying to align a different cost basis to an existing cost model that they need to kind of understand.
Yeah, I would say definitely start by segmenting your customers into you'll have into, I guess, like the long tail versus like the very, very important, like very large customers. The long tail, you can send a mass email and, live with the churn. And usually, depending on how valuable your offering is, churn rates can be like really, really low. And I would say even the open rates for these emails are probably pretty low. Versus for your important accounts, you need to let the sales team handle these conversations. You need to let the AMs know well in advance of what's happening. Explain it super, super clearly with AMs. Make sure that you have them on board, and then allow the AMs to have this discussion. Either they get to make the call of when is the right time. They either do it on the spot, or honestly, more often than not, they kind of wait until like maybe like renewal conversations are in progress, or maybe you've done like a QBR and you've exhibited amazing value. They are probably the ones to determine when is the best moment. And I can give you examples with that too. When we're doing some like this really big repricing projects at Stripe, a big part of it was, repricing also some of these larger users. And our AMs were very vocal on not kind of reaching out to any users after, for example, one of them had a billing error, or the other one had like the product was down for like, like a tiny bit of time, things like that. So let the AMs make the call there.
Yeah, I think that's a really poignant word of wisdom to wrap up on. So this has been phenomenal, Spyri. Thank you again so much for sharing your time with us. If folks are interested in learning more about pricing and pricing software or other things, do you have any resources that you would recommend they explore?
Yeah, for sure. I think OpenView has some really good material on pricing. I'm happy to share some afterwards. But yeah, also feel free to reach out to me too. Love to have more conversations. Always love to jump on topics related to pricing. So yeah, you have my contact information then. But I think it's pretty much spiri@dealops.com. Thank you so much.
Well, all right. With that, we'll drop for today. I appreciate everybody joining us here the day before a national holiday. It was a great conversation, and we're looking forward to having more of them. Quick note, we're going to be back with another webinar talking to an SVP about a product management career trajectory and some steps that you can take to optimize your journey along the way. And then we're working on organizing an in-person event for our New York City community in September. So please stay tuned for more information on that. Super excited to get our group back together in person for the first time in a while. All right. Thanks all. Have a great holiday weekend.
Bye.